Welcome, everybody, to the Week 3 matchup breakdown here on DraftKings TV. I'm David Kitchen. Joining me, three studly fellows, DraftKings analysts, Adam Levitan, Drew Dinkmeyer, and Andrew Wiggins. The original Andrew Wiggins, right, Andrew?
Yo, G.
All right, so we have the first 2 weeks out of the way. Adam, we can start seeing a little bit of trends going on, even though there still are some room for surprises in Week 3.
And prizes.
There's prizes, right?
Surprises and prizes. Yeah, I think the story so far has been kind of the uncertainty at the running back position. I think we're going to get to some plays today where there's a little bit more certainty at the running back position heading into this week. And I also want to say that the Pope is here in Philadelphia this weekend, and I am asking him for some divine intervention with my lineups.
I thought you were going to ask for like divine intervention for that Phillies offense. I mean, the Philadelphia offense, the Eagles offense. Well, and
all offenses in Philadelphia right now are more offensive than we'd like.
It is definitely a daily fantasy city as far as that goes. So is Denver. Anyways, let's move on to the first game of the night. Tonight's matchup, the Thursday night matchup, Washington at the New York Giants. Drew, I'll start with you. Thoughts on this game? Is this a game that you think we should fade altogether?
I think it's an interesting game from the standpoint that what these two teams do well, the other team kind of does well. So like Washington wants to control the ball on the ground, but the Giants' run defense has been pretty good early in the season. And then, the Giants side of the ball, they like to air it out. And that's probably a better matchup with Washington with how they're structured because they're very good against the run in terms of their defense. So I think the two plays that stand out in this game most are Odell Beckham Jr. and Jordan Reed. Reed's got the more favorable price point, obviously, of the two in a little bit thinner position, so he's probably easier to play. But I think all the peripheral plays in this game are potential traps, in my opinion, like the guys like Matt Jones, who obviously had a breakout week last week. So I do think there is some merit to potentially getting some exposure to this game with Reed or Beckham, but on the whole, not going all in on this game tonight.
Yeah, Jordan Reed, Adam, at 3,800 might be a guy that you just plug in and you see kind of what your lineup might look like on Sunday for the Thursday night lineups.
Yeah, I mean, we know Jordan Reed is a player. I was upset with myself. I got scared off of him last week with that midweek quad tweak and a reasonably tough matchup, alleged tough matchup with the Rams. But he looked really good on Sunday, played over 80% of the snaps and isn't even on the injury report this week. So I definitely think Jordan Reed is a good play against a pretty talentless Giants linebackers and safety group.
Cool. We'll move on to the next game, Sunday's game, Atlanta at Dallas. And Andrew, this is the game that has kind of like the injury story written on it with the running back situation in Atlanta and the quarterback situation, and wide receiver situation in Dallas.
Yeah, so Freeman was a guy that I was definitely looking at. I just saw this morning that Coleman might actually play this weekend, so that's going to throw some uncertainty into that situation. It's something to keep an eye on. If he does go, I think just given that he's banged up, I'm not going to look at him. I'll just stay away from that running back situation. Joseph Randle is a guy who I might consider. He's been getting the touches. There hasn't really been the production, but I think there's going to be one of these games where he knocks a few into the end zone. This might be it. But generally, I think I'm just going to stay away from this game for the most part.
Drew, Whedon. 5,100? Yes. 5,200.
Yeah. I'm not on the Brandon Whedon bandwagon. I think I'm taking Andrew's approach in general. I'm tired of playing players in Cowboys games. Like, I just want the Cowboys removed from the slate altogether because they play so freaking slow. Their defense is playing so well right now under Rod Marinelli. And they're just it's a frustrating game to watch. And we saw that last week with Philadelphia. So Whedon's not of interest to me. The one injury I'm monitoring on Dallas' side is whether Jason Witten's able to go or not. Gavin Escobar is a guy that's a pretty talented tight end option. And I think Whedon will be more prone when he throws to kind of look to the middle of the field, check downs and tight ends and different things that you often see with younger quarterbacks or with backup quarterbacks. So the Witten injury is one that I'm keeping an eye on. And then on Atlanta side of the ball, obviously Freeman and Coleman is one to monitor. I kind of hope Coleman doesn't play. Freeman is a guy that's just not very talented, in my opinion, but has a lot of opportunity in the pass game. And so he could make his way, in a Danny Woodhead type role of kind of grinding out 50 to 60 yards on the ground and then another 40 to 50 through the air with 4 or 5 catches.
Yeah, and Adam, as far as Drew mentioned it, the little passes, what does that mean for this Dallas wide receiver core? You had Terrence Williams, who was he and Cole Beasley relatively quiet last week until that big T-Will touchdown, which I know all you guys were on T-Will over Beasley, so it helped you guys out.
Yeah, thank God for that late T-Will touchdown. But on Sunday night, I had a long conversation with myself about attacking guys in the Dallas game, and I'm trying to stick to that this week, even though if Devontae Freeman was 3,000, I would be like, yeah, let me saddle up Devontae Freeman. At 4,600, I feel like it's a little steep for how well Dallas is playing and how slow they're playing and how lack of talented Devontae Freeman is. But yeah, with Whedon in there, I think Whedon can play a little bit more than people think. People make fun of him because he's like 45 years old and he has red hair and all this, but I think he can really sling it. I would not be shocked if Terrence Williams had a decent game. It's just hard for me to pull the trigger on him with Whedon back there.
Adam, right. Can I ask you a question? Freeman or Woodhead if Tevin Coleman's out?
Yeah, I think I would go Woodhead, given the spot against Minnesota, who I think is going to struggle to kind of keep that game low scoring. I do like, we'll get to it later, but I like Melvin Gordon in this spot too, but we can get to that later.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we get to the San Diego game. Okay, Drew? All right, let's move on to the Indy at Tennessee game. I'll actually be at this game in the DraftKings suite there in Nashville, so I'm excited to roster some guys from here, and I think there are plenty of people to roster. Andrew, do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, it seems like a really good spot for Luck and crew to bounce back. They've clearly underachieved the first 2 weeks, and I don't expect that to continue on for the rest of the season. So I like Luck as a potential quarterback option. I think Moncrief looked fantastic last game. It seems like he could be taking over the number 2 wide receiver spot there, and he comes in at a pretty good price of $4,800. So he's a guy I'll be considering. And then I want to be watching the status of Dwayne Allen. When he missed some games last year, Kobe Fleener actually threw together a number of reasonably productive outings. So he could be a guy worth considering if Allen doesn't go.
Drew, thoughts on either of these offenses?
Not on Danny Woodhead?
No, not on Danny Woodhead.
Yeah, I think both sides of the ball are pretty interesting. I agree with Andrew that Luck is in a good spot, and I think Moncrief and Hilton both. I thought Hilton looked surprisingly healthy on Monday night, given all the concerns, and was getting kind of up and down the field in pretty good shape. I think they're both interesting plays. I think Frank Gore, he looked spry in the first half, and then obviously he had that really bad fumble around the goal line. But I do think he's somewhat interesting as maybe a contrarian kind of tournament option because he is a guy that could get 2 touchdowns in this game, given Tennessee's struggles on the whole defensively. And then on Tennessee's side of the ball, I think we've seen that opposing offenses haven't had problems moving the ball against Indianapolis. So I think Marcus Mariota is interesting. I know Adam likes Kendall Wright. So I think there are interesting plays on both sides of the ball here.
Yeah, I'm a big Kendall Wright fan as well this week, Adam. So I'll let you go ahead and take that and also talk about a little bit about Marcus Mariota.
Yeah, I mean, the Colts corner situation is really bad right now. Vontae Davis suffered a concussion on Monday. He's questionable, but even if Vontae Davis is able to play, he rarely goes into the slot. And that's obviously where Kendall Wright plays the vast majority of his snaps. So the other corners that Kendall Wright's looking to match up with will be Darius Butler or maybe a little Greg Toller if those guys can get cleared. Right now, I consider them both doubtful. If they can't play, it'll be like Jaleel Brown again. And we saw what Eric Decker did to Jaleel Brown in the first half on Monday night. I think that Mariota and Kendall Wright will not have any problems moving the ball all over the field against this Indianapolis defense. But I do think it could potentially turn into a shootout because, Indy has played 2 of the best defenses in the league so far. We're talking about Buffalo and we're talking about the Jets, and now they get to play Tennessee. It's just like people are going to think that the Colts offense stinks now when in fact they've already played 2 of the best defenses in the league.
Yeah, I think the issue with Andrew Luck is just his price point this week on DraftKings, like being in that elite tier, and we haven't seen elite Andrew Luck. But if there's a week to be elite, this would be it in week 3. Would also agree about Kendall Wright and Marcus Mariota, and plus Delaney Walker's on track to play in week 3. And I think you also see Dorial Green Beckham starting to get used to kind of the speed of the game, caught a touchdown pass on Sunday. So there are some offensive weapons for Mariota. Let's move on to the next game, Oakland at Cleveland. There are a few good plays. Andrew, I'll start with you again first. And Andrew, I'm making a concerted effort to start with you first because someone said they noticed how I was using you as table scraps last week.
Well, thanks for letting me go first. I like Latavius Murray in this game. He's been getting all the touches there. Coming into the season, we thought that Helu would be the passing back, and that hasn't been the case. So Murray, I think, is generally he's game script neutral in the sense that if they're behind, he's going to be in there catching. If they're ahead, he'll be pounding away. So I like that about him. He's a safe pick. Good price at $5,800. The deep sleeper I'm going to throw at you guys, it's not a guy I would consider in cash games, but maybe you throw him in some tournaments, is Gary Barnidge. Tight ends have been ripping up Oakland so far. You had Crockett Gilmore last week with the game of his life. And the week prior, I'm blanking on who it was, but it was somebody that also had a big game. Barnidge is $2,500. Maybe you could consider him in the Millie Maker.
Ooh, a little GPP throw out there. All right. Drew, you want to follow up on this?
Yeah, I think it's nice of you to start the Oakland-Cleveland game off with Andrew. That was a really nice gesture. The best, most exciting game of the week, giving it to Andrew first. But I'll try to pick up where he left off. I do agree with Latavius Murray, one of the few backs in the league. One of the things we like to talk about is market share, and that's the percentage of opportunities, whether it's targets, carries, red zone carries that a player is getting from their team. And Latavius Murray is one of the few guys in the league that's getting 70% or more of the carries, 10% or more of the targets, and 30% or more of the red zone looks. And when you get a back that's doing all three, as Andrew mentioned, they are game script neutral. They are safe in kind of all circumstances, and those are great guys to target in cash games. So I do like Latavius Murray. He's probably the only play that I'm really focused on from this game.
Yeah. Adam, I'll save you for the next game. You don't even have to comment on this game.
I don't want to comment on Gary Barnidge.
Gary Barnidge, I'll also throw another GPP guy out, 3,400 running back Duke Johnson. They did say that he was getting involved more and more into this offense. So if you can have a game of 15 or 20 for him, you might be in a good spot there. Cincinnati at Baltimore. Adam, I'll start with you first in this one.
Yeah, Cincinnati is a team that I think plays better defensively than people realize, especially in the secondary. So I definitely getting off of the Steve Smith train. I do not think it's a wacko for Flacco week. If anything, I would consider AJ Green. I played AJ Green weeks 1 and weeks 2 and been happy with his ownership levels, but not overly happy with his production. So he's probably going to see a lot of Jimmy Smith this week, which is a matchup that he can win, but it's not exactly a plus matchup. So probably less plays in this game than one would expect for two teams with reasonably good offenses. I'm also, we talked about Justin Forsett last week, and I think we expressed concerns that maybe he's just not that good. And I think the Ravens see that a little bit using Lorenzo Taliaferro last week so much. So that would scare me a little bit too.
Yeah, definitely would scare me away for this week as well. As far as Drew, the running back situation in Cincinnati.
Yeah, that was interesting last week that Jeremy Hill fumbled twice, and then we saw a lot of Giovanni Bernard. I'm not particularly excited about Cincinnati's offense as a whole in this game, just because I know Baltimore got absolutely run up and down the field by Oakland last week, and that might look like a spot to kind of attack. But Andy Dalton has been horrific against Baltimore in his career. He's been horrific in division throughout his career. And so I stray away from Cincinnati in divisional games often because I just don't trust Andy Dalton against defenses that have seen him lots and lots of times. So I'm not as high on this situation. I think Hill will regain the lion's share of carries. But I think Bernard's probably a better matchup in terms of a back that can contribute in the passing game and be a little bit slippery, as opposed to Jeremy Hill, who kind of, pounds in the middle and works the interior line. Baltimore's a little bit more susceptible to kind of those pass catching backs than the ones they're moving on the ground. So if you're choosing, I would say Gio over Hill this week in this specific matchup, but I'm short on the Cincinnati offense as a whole.
Yeah, and at 4,700, I think Gio Bernard is nothing but a tournament play there. I don't think you're putting him in cash games. And there's another guy around that same price point in this next game, Jacksonville at New England. Man, if Al Smizzle, fellow DraftKings analyst, was on with us, I feel like he might be saying it's a trap because that's what he likes to say with Dion Lewis. But his price is so low. Andrew, is this a trap game for Dion Lewis?
It's a really tough spot because I feel like we've been here before where the running back has been anointed the guy in New England, and then you get to the next game and something happens and they're out early. Maybe they fumble. Now, Dion Lewis has got through 2 fumbles already where he didn't get pulled. But what concerns me about this game is the script seems to set up well for LeGarrette Blount, where they could just be pounding the ball. I think Bill Belichick is a really smart guy. Dion Lewis seems like the guy they want to have fresh for the whole year. So here's a spot where maybe you can get him a few less touches. And if LeGarrette gets in there, he's moving the chains. I could see him sticking with them. So I would not be shocked at all if you see 15-plus touches from LeGarrette, and that means less touches for Dion. However, his price is really low. He catches passes. So it's one of these spots that I'm not really sure about. It's a really tough decision. I think I'll probably have some of him, but not go too crazy. Maybe he's a bit more of a GPP than cash game play.
And Drew, we were talking a little bit off air just about like Dion Lewis, like your thoughts about this running back situation. Like reading the mind of Bill Belichick is like not a positive situation in most cases for daily fantasy players.
Yeah, and if you can do it, there's big upside as we saw last year with the Gomes brothers who are on our TVs every day with Jonas Gray, at like 0.5% owned and 46 fantasy points. If you can nail the situation, there's big upside there. Dion Lewis is a really, really talented back. I think there's a good chance that he's their lead back, but I really am looking to this week as the week to decide if it's a lead back situation or a situational game plan dependent situation. And Belichick historically, he looks at game plans, not game scripts. So I saw, I got into some interactions on Twitter last week where people were talking about how it's set up for LeGarrette Blount in the second half because the Patriots were ahead. I don't think that's the way they plan games. I think they plan that game as a Dion Lewis game because Buffalo's front seven is so stout and tough to attack. So I think with a little bit of a softer front seven in Jacksonville, this could be a game plan dependent game for LeGarrette Blount, which is why both of these guys for me are more tournament plays. I do think there's something interesting in the fact that Lewis has been on the field after those fumbles that might signify that he's their guy. But I'm not going to take that approach in cash games just yet. I think this week is a good signal. If we get Lewis getting the bulk of the carries, I think he's the number one guy this year in Belichick's mind. I think if we see Blount, then it's going to be a more game plan dependent situation moving forward.
And Adam, we'll stick on the situation because it's a pretty important thing. But in 2010, the Patriots had Ben Jarvis Green-Ellis, who they used as their main guy. In 2012, they had Stephen Ridley, who they used as the main guy. Could 2015 be the year of Dion Lewis and not a running back by committee in New England?
I don't know. I mean, Dion Lewis is like 190 pounds, right? So the other guys that you're talking about, like Ben Jarvis and Ridley, those guys are like 225, 230. I don't know. Like the fact that he fumbled twice and got back in there is obviously very, very interesting. My concern for this week in tournaments is that they're facing Jacksonville and everybody has seen him go off in 2 straight weeks. I think his ownership is going to be super, super elevated, maybe up to 15 or 16% and something like the Millie Maker, which concerns me with so many questions around him.
All right, let's talk about passing game in this for both of these offenses. You've got Allen Robinson, Blake Bortles for Jacksonville, maybe even Hearn. And on the other side, you have a lot of options, Andrew.
Yeah, there's 2 cheap options in Hearns and Robinson. One thing that does concern me a bit is that the Jags are only projected to score 17 points, which is a little bit lower than I would have anticipated. I would have thought maybe like 18 or 19. It's not like New England's been great. I mean, Tyrod lit them up last week. So I'm pumping the brakes a little bit there, but the prices are good. So I think either one of them can be considered. On the other side, I think Edelman's a fantastic play. He's just been peppered with targets so far. And there's a little bit of a concern that they just get out to a massive lead. They don't need to throw the ball much. But I think that's probably a risk worth taking given the matchup and just what Edelman's done so far. So, and then, of course, you can't overlook Gronk. I mean, Gronk is Gronk. So I'll be strongly considering him at the tight end position.
And Drew, you talked about game planning, which is interesting because people were wondering in the fourth quarter while they were still throwing the ball and not milking the clock against the Bills offense or the Bills defense. But this might be a situation where they just want to throttle whoever they play this year.
Yeah, there's certainly some narrative on that. We have the history with Brady and the Patriots kind of running it up after an offseason where they've been frustrated with the media focus and the NFL's coverage. So there's certainly some narrative street merit to that. I think this is an interesting game. The thing that's so cool about New England right now is their market shares are so tight. Their whole offense is basically running through Edelman, Gronk, and then running back. And so far, that running back has been Dion Lewis. But when you get these really tight market shares, even if you're concerned about game script, if guys are going to get 30+% of the targets, even if they're only going to throw it, 30 times, 25 times, that's still a ton of targets. So I think Edelman and Gronk are still very safe for cash games. I don't think you have to worry about game script, even if they game plan to be a little bit more run-oriented in this one.
Yeah, Gronk at 7,400 is like way above any of the other tight ends, so he has to have a decent game to be a good cash option. I want to ask you this, though, Adam. When you talk about Luck versus Tom Brady this week, both in that same price point, who do you have?
Yeah, I think I prefer Tom Brady. And if they do blow them out, I think it's going to be a ton of Brady. So that doesn't concern me that much. He's also at home. I just prefer Brady slightly. That's not to say that Luck isn't a great play because I think he obviously is.
All right. So we spent a lot of time on that game, but that's okay because I feel like this game is very important to setting lineups this week. All right. New Orleans at Carolina. And again, we have the Dallas offense, the Philly offense, and the New Orleans offense. So just hasn't been what we have expected. Drew, I'll start with you in this game from the New Orleans side.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in anybody from the New Orleans side. Brandon Cooks hasn't really taken that step forward. We're unsure on Drew Brees' status going into the week, even if he does play, how healthy is really the shoulder. The matchup isn't great on the ground, so I'm not particularly excited on New Orleans side of the ball at all this game.
All right, what about for Carolina, Drew?
I like Cam Newton, and I think Cam is the most direct source of points for an offense that kind of spreads it around outside of him, but he's running a ton. He's running around the goal line. New Orleans defense is really soft. We saw Jameis get a rushing touchdown last week. So I really like Cam. That 6,800 price point on DraftKings is really enticing.
Cam has a new nickname, and it's floating around the DFS community on Twitter. It's Cammy No Stacks because you don't have to stack him with anybody. You play him, and you don't worry about pairing him with a receiver or a tight end. He is his own man, Andrew.
Yeah, I wouldn't overlook Craig Olsen. I know he had the quiet week one. He had a pretty decent week last week, I think somewhere around 6 for 70. But the number that really stood out to me is he had 14 targets. So Cam is looking his way. I would expect that to continue. He's going to have a couple big weeks. There's no question about it. Will this be one of them? I don't know, but decent chance it is. Also like Jonathan Stewart. Certainly you wouldn't want to stack him with Cam, but it seems like a sets up well for him. So those are kind of the three guys that I'm looking at from this game. I'm ignoring the New Orleans side as well.
Adam, do you have anything to add to this to clean up the situation?
Yeah, I have a GPP stack for Cam. I think Ted Ginn is flying way under the radar, and he's not a guy that I typically roster, but he has seen 16 targets through 2 games, and he is capable of busting long plays. That's what he does, obviously, and this is still a secondary without Keenan Lewis and Jarvis Byrd that I do want to attack. So I think a Cam Ted Ginn stack kind of gives you some upside, and I think Ted Ginn is still in the return game for a little double dip action too in GPPs.
Ted Ginn this week's Travis Benjamin?
Except Ted Ginn actually gets targets and snaps.
Yeah, Travis Benjamin has to have the most points per catches ever for fantasy. Let's just move on though. Philly at the New York Jets, and this has like interesting written all over it. And Drew, I think it probably has GPP written all over it as well.
Yeah, so after last week's debacle, I think you can count on Philadelphia ownerships going, down the drain in tournaments, which I think presents an opportunity because they're still playing at a ridiculously fast pace. And if the offense does get clicking in any sort of way, They're an offense that can even get on track against really good defenses because they play so fast that they don't give defenses a lot of time to set up the unusual blitzes and different things that they do. So again, I won't be going near any of the Philadelphia offense in cash games, but I do think, getting a team that plays at the fastest pace in the league at low ownerships and GPPs is never a bad idea. And so I think Bradford and Matthews or Bradford and Aguilar are potential stacks in tournaments.
Adam, we had a little bit of news yesterday, and again, DeMarco Murray not practicing today. He's going to test it out tomorrow and Saturday, but this is something that could be a pretty big deal to this Philly offense.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan Matthews is a player. Let's say that. I mean, I think that Ryan Matthews is more than capable of being a starting running back in this league and being a plus starting running back in this league. Even though the matchup is awful against the really good Jets. Front seven, I'm not even sure what Ryan Matthews' price is. I think it's like 3,300.
Yeah,
something like that. I mean, I would definitely have to consider him if we get news that DeMarco Murray will not play. So, yeah, but I think the guy everybody wants to have in this game is Brandon Marshall, who's just set up perfectly with Eric Decker hurt and Chris Owusu hurt, and Philly's defense funneling so much towards the pass game, and Byron Waxwell proving to be just a product of Seattle's system and maybe not that talented. So I think Brandon Marshall just 100% of cash game guy for a lot of people this week.
Yeah, and Marshall was a guy that after Vontae Davis went down last week in the Monday night game and after Eric Decker went down, like he just kind of exploded, Andrew.
Yeah, and I think he's a guy who maybe got a little bit of a bad rap because last year he was hurt. He ended up kind of playing hurt for a while, and then he ended the season early. But he had been playing well prior to the injury, and before that, I mean, he had so many good years in a row that people are just overlooking him a little bit. And he looked great after Vontae Davis went out and when Decker got banged up. I mean, Marshall took over at the end of that game. I think he ended with about 7 catches, 100 yards, and a touchdown. I love him this week.
Yeah, as far as the other kind of injury news, that reports came out that Ivory was really sore, Adam. You got Bilal Powell, who is minimum salary on DraftKings this week.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris Ivory's going to play through soreness. I mean, let's be honest. He's in the NFL, you know what I mean? But yeah, I don't like to use running backs against Philly, but Chris Ivory is a super talented guy that I would consider. I don't think I'd really consider Bilal Powell unless we got news that Chris Ivory was completely ruled out.
Fair enough. Let's move on. Tampa Bay at Houston. This is an ugly game. So, Drew, I'll give it to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I think the play that I'm most interested in from this game would be Houston's defense. I think there's still going to be a lot of value in trying to pick on Jameis Winston with opposing defenses. And I think there's another defense that we're going to talk about later that will be really, really highly owned this week. So I think Houston is a good pivot in tournaments to come with lower ownership.
All right, let's just move on from this game. San Diego at Minnesota, and that means we get to talk about Danny Woodhead, Drew. So finally, we're talking about him. 4,400 against this Minnesota defense. He had a complete dud, though, Andrew, last week until like midway through the fourth quarter.
Yeah, well, Melvin Gordon came out looking great. He ripped off a couple of huge runs early, and they were sticking with him for the most part. But then they got behind, and Woodhead was in there at the end, was able to grab a couple of passes. I think he ended up with maybe 5 catches for 50 yards or so. And I think he was around 100 yards total. So he ended up salvaging the game, had a pretty nice game for his price, especially on DraftKings. But it does concern me a little bit that he wasn't in there early and he had to come in what was effectively garbage time. But he is still really cheap at 4,400, and he has been involved in the red zone. There's a lot of stuff to like, but he does come with some risk.
Yeah, and Adam, I'll let you talk about this running back situation because I know you liked Melvin Gordon this week as well. And like Andrew said, he was really nice last week.
Yeah, I think Melvin Gordon's really sneaky because everybody's all Danny Woodheaded up and not that many people are on Melvin Gordon. But I think kind of like Tevin Coleman, if you give Melvin Gordon 15, 16, 17 touches a game, he is going to break like long touchdown or touchdowns. It's going to happen. I think this is a fine spot for it to happen against the Minnesota defense that has been pretty bad against the run for the last year. So I think that Melvin Gordon is both cheap and will come with low ownership this week.
Drew, you've got Adrian Peterson, who's one of 5 running backs in that same price tier. Your thoughts on AP versus San Diego this week?
Yeah, AP looked incredible last week. I know he didn't get the red zone, didn't get into the end zone and really kind of catapult that score, but ran all over a really good Detroit front seven in terms of a team that we expect to be pretty good against the run. So I'm excited, at home. San Diego, I think, is a softer front seven than Detroit. And I think, at home is a really key thing for Adrian Peterson and the Vikings offense as a whole. With a young quarterback at the helm, I think you can expect them to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more productive at home. So I do like AP a lot in that tier. It's a very crowded tier with Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell coming back, Marshawn Lynch in a great spot. But I will definitely have some exposure to Adrian Peterson as well.
All right, guys. Thumbs up or thumbs down on 2 options: Stevie Johnson and Ladarius Green.
Yeah, I should say Ladarius Green's probably not going to play. 2 concussions in 11 days, but I do like Stevie Johnson out of the slot. I think Xavier Rhodes is going to spend more time on Keenan Allen and give Stevie a little bit better matchup against Captain Wonderland on the inside. So, yeah, definitely on the Stevie train.
Drew,
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And the fact that Ladarius is out, that replaces a pass catcher with a total 0 of a pass catcher in like a John Phillips or whoever they have playing backup tight end. So I think you're going to see a concentration of targets. And I think funneling them to Stevie Johnson is probably the main guy that's going to benefit.
All right, I've got the dog barking at the mailman in the background, so I'll get to the next game real quick, and that is Pittsburgh at St. Louis.
Yeah, this is an interesting game, I think, because it's higher scoring than most people associate with a Rams game. So I think the total is up around 47, and that's just a testament to how strong Pittsburgh's offense is and how strong it was without Le'Veon Bell. I don't think there's any way that I can not play Antonio Brown in cash games. I don't know if that's a good strategy or not because he's so expensive, but it's like I don't feel comfortable going into my cash game lineup without Antonio Brown. I'd rather, if I put a gun to my head and say you can only have one in your cash game, Antonio Brown or Rob Gronkowski, I'd rather have Antonio Brown. Is that a mistake, Drew?
That's a great question. I think Antonio Brown's become like the cash game binky. He's your little blanket that you want to walk around with in your cash games because you feel better when he's in those cash game lineups. And I mean, the streak that everybody talks about, 5 for 50, basically every time in the last like 2 or 3 years. So I think he's a great foundation and building block. I'm having that tough decision between Brown and Gronkowski. I'm the type of guy who runs a couple different cash game lineups for NFL just because I like to minimize some injury risk. And I think Brown and Gronkowski will both make their way into my cash game lineups this week. But I probably won't have 100% of either because I think you have to kind of choose between the two.
Yeah, and have to go cheap at one position at least, probably quarterback if you do that. And there are some cheap quarterbacks this week. But Antonio Binky Brown, is that his new nickname, Drew?
I think we should go with it. I think we should roll with Antonio Binky Brown.
All right. Andrew, your thoughts on this game?
Well, you mentioned cheap quarterbacks. I think there's one in this game, and Nick Foles. The Pittsburgh defense is not good. They've consistently giving up a lot of points to opposing quarterbacks. And the total is decent for St. Louis at home. So I do like Nick Foles as a GPP play. I probably wouldn't consider him in cash. Antonio Brown, it's a tough call for me. He's on the road, not a great matchup. He's very expensive. I'm not going to completely fade him, but he's not one of my favorite plays of the week. And then Le'Veon Bell's another guy that I think is a tough decision. He's coming back. You're not quite sure how many touches he's going to get. I would guess he'll probably get around 18, which maybe isn't quite enough for that price point, especially being on the road. And, again, not a great matchup. But he's a guy you always have to be considering.
Yeah, and he's like Drew was saying that reading the mind of Bill Belichick, like if you get that right, it pays off. I feel like getting the situation right when they're coming back from suspension or coming back from injury is also where it can pay off. And I think a lot of people will be avoiding Le'Veon Bell because of the concerns about them easing him into this lineup. But with 15 to 18 touches, he could still do a lot with those. I think you saw last week, D'Angelo Williams, he just got a couple like cheapies, like got a couple of easy touchdowns. And if that happens, the same thing, a couple of pass interference calls in the end zone and Le'Veon Bell suddenly becomes a good play. But again, he's in that price range with all those other running backs that are expected to get a full load. So,
and one other thing worth mentioning is that Pittsburgh went for 2 a bunch last game, and it seems like that's something that might continue. So that is a bump to everyone. I think they like to throw it in those situations too, so it might help Antonio Brown more than anyone else, but it also could be helping Le'Veon Bell. It'd be really interesting to watch him continue that.
And I thought about you also because of the Heath Miller call last week. And you saw when they scored the touchdown, like immediately the first thing on Ben Roethlisberger's mind was go for 2. That's the first thing he did. He didn't even celebrate. He just started motioning over to the sideline, like we're going for 2. And then, and Heath Miller and Jared Cook, I think 2 GPP options in this game because just their price point. All right, let's move on to San Francisco at Arizona. Adam, what's going on with this Arizona running back situation?
Yeah, I mean, Bruce Arians does not want to give David Johnson too much too soon. And I kind of believe him. He said David Johnson's role will grow slowly a little bit more each week. Well, last week, I believe it was 7 touches. Maybe this week it's 9 or 10, but I'd be real hesitant to project anything more than that for David Johnson. And given how popular he is and how everybody's talking about him, I think there's a chance he'll be over-owned at 4,000 for somebody that's only going to get 7 to 10 touches at most. I obviously won't roster Chris Johnson. I think the plays that are also going to be popular in this game, I think Carson Palmer will be the most owned quarterback this week down at 6,600 and coming off 7 touchdowns in 2 weeks. Very good matchup against the young and perhaps not that good San Francisco secondary that everybody saw get lit on fire last week by Ben Roethlisberger. So I think Carson Palmer is a fine cash game quarterback. I think he'll be very, very popular though.
Yeah, another guy that might be popular from that same offense, Drew, Larry Fitzgerald, just had an unbelievable week last week, and John Brown wasn't really a factor, but it's clear, though, that Carson Palmer is back in old form, and he's got weapons.
Yeah, and those are the 2 primary weapons that he's targeting. And I know John Brown didn't light up the box score, but he drew 2 deep pass interference penalties last week on Kyle Fuller that easily could have been long touchdowns if Fuller didn't interfere with him. So the opportunities are still there for John Brown. I do think this is a week. This is one of those kind of seesaw weeks where last week was a Larry Fitzgerald week. Maybe this week is the John Brown week to get one of those deep plays because we saw small wide receiver that runs crisp routes and kind of is used all over the field. We saw Antonio Brown light up San Francisco secondary last week, and John Brown's certainly not as good as Antonio Brown, but he's sort of built in that kind of mold. So I think this could be a John Brown week for Carson Palmer.
Let's go to Andrew as far as on the opposite side. We talked about how Carlos Hyde did look good last week. Are you comfortable with playing him this week?
Not in this matchup. I think it's just too tough of a matchup for a running back like him that's trying to get up the middle. And really that whole offense, I know Hyde was out at the end of the game, but they did not do much until the fourth quarter. Then they piled out a bunch of stats in the fourth. So you got to be a little bit careful when you're looking at the box scores. And there was some fluky stuff. Torrey Smith caught a 75-yard touchdown. That's not something I would count on. It's just not an offense that I'm really targeting at all. Especially this week. So, I'm not really considering anyone on that side.
Tyrod Taylor in this next game, Buffalo at Miami. Of course, Adam, I'm going to start with you.
Naked Tyrod. No. This is his first road test, right? I mean, he had a very, very good matchup in week 1 home against Indy. And for the first half of week 2 home against the Patriots, he looked very, very bad. Racked up a ton of points in garbage time, though, which is encouraging because he does have the ability when teams kind of sit back to just completely light up the box score. So I definitely like him again in this spot. It would not bother me at all if they get behind to the Dolphins. The Dolphins definitely have major questions in the secondary. They're far, far weaker in the secondary than they are against the run. Tyrod Taylor is a play every week because he's going to run for 40 to 50 yards every week with a ceiling of 100, and not exaggerating, a literal ceiling of 100 rushing yards in a game. So I'm definitely gonna have some Tyrod. I mean, there's a lot of I love going cheap at quarterback, especially in cash and even in GPPs too. I think there's a lot of talk about Ryan Fitzpatrick as the punt at quarterback. I think Mariota makes some sense as a punt at quarterback, and I think Tyrod Taylor is in that conversation too.
Yeah, Drew, it seems like with Tyrod, especially if he's playing from behind, he's in a pretty good spot. On the other side, though, you've got Tannehill and you've got two guys. This is a low team total, so I'm not sure how much you want to target them, but Jarvis Landry and Rashard Matthews as a low GPP save your money guy.
Yeah, and I think we saw last week that those kind of intermediate route possession wide receivers like Julian Edelman that run really tight routes can still give any cornerbacks fits, and the Bills have some good ones, but Gilmore's kind of a bigger guy who likes to play on the outside. So I think they have some weaknesses potentially with those smaller wide receivers that run the intermediate routes, and that's probably the best place to attack that very, very good defense on the whole. So I do think Landry and Matthews are interesting. I also want to note that when you said Tyrod instead of Ty God, my lights flashed around me. I don't know if the Pope had any influence on this that Adam's been visiting with, but I just want it to be known that Tyrod instead of Ty God got my lights flashing around me.
Yeah, no, I'm going to call him Tyrod, and then when he does well, I'm just going to call him God. I'm just going to drop the tie altogether, just go God.
Well, all right, let's move on to Chicago at Seattle. Seattle 0-2. And, as far as Russell Wilson, he needs to be drinking more of that water that he has. Drew, I'll start with you. No, I'm sorry, Drew. I'll start with Andrew.
Start with Andrew.
Yeah, well, the Bears are in trouble this week. It's a huge spread. The Bears are projected to only score around 14 and I think 14.5 points, which is one of the lowest team totals you'll ever see. You got to love the Seahawks defense. They've struggled a bit the first 2 weeks. This is a perfect opportunity to get right, getting Jimmy Clausen to come out to Seattle. It's not going to be pretty. As far as on the Seattle side of the ball, you got to like Russell, you got to like Lynch. And Jimmy Graham's another guy who's been complaining a little bit in the media about not being happy about his role. Maybe here's a spot where they feed him a few targets, get him in the end zone, and put a smile back on Jimmy's face.
Yeah, and if Peter was here, Peter Jennings, he'd say, "Oh yeah, a little bit of narrative street," because he would love. I guarantee you, he loves the fact that Jimmy came out and said that he is like not happy, and I think that's probably even an understatement. Drew, I'll let you take this narrative street angle because I know how much you like to play.
Yeah, I love narrative street. You know me, and it worked out so well. Last week with DeMarco Murray's revenge game, all that pent up revenge and rage, and he ran so effectively for 2 yards on 13 carries. But I do think the Bears defense is one that I think you can do whatever you want with it. Really, I mean, from an offensive standpoint, I think they can move the ball on the ground, they can move the ball through the air. So I think this is an opportunity where the matchup also corresponds to a player kind of complaining that there might be more opportunity. And if there's more opportunity, he's going to score way more points because this matchup is so favorable. So I think, you definitely want to have some Seattle exposure in your lineups, in your cash games, in your GPPs, whether it's the defense, whether it's Russ, whether it's Marshawn, whether it's Jimmy Graham. This seems like a 40+ point win for Seattle. Like this is such a bad matchup, and Seattle getting Cam Chancellor back defensively. That stadium's going to be rocking, their first home game of the year. I can't see any way the Bears keep this within striking distance at all.
Yeah. And usually, just like in season-long leagues, when you pick your defense last, because we're not even talking about kickers right now, but when you pick your defense last, a lot of times in your daily fantasy lineups, you're picking your defense last as well. But, man, it just seems like if you can somehow get to that Seattle Seahawks defense, Adam, you want to take it. It's 3,400, so it's not cheap, especially when some of those other price points are $700 or $800 cheaper. But it just seems like as far as upside go, they definitely have the most upside in this game.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. Like 0-2 Seattle at home against Jimmy Clausen, getting Cam Chancellor back. Like it's going to be a train wreck for the Bears. I want to get to that 3,400. If you can't, I do think that New England is fine. I think Arizona is fine. I think we talked about Houston is an interesting play. And those are all 3,000 or 3,100. I think those are okay, but I will be trying to get to Seattle, especially in cash.
And remember last week, the Bears started off with an opening kickoff return touchdown allowed against them, and Tyler Lockett is just absolutely electric in the return game. So I think there's a lot of different ways the Seattle defense could put points on the board this week.
What do you guys think the ownership will be of Seattle defense? Because in tournaments, it might be so high that you just want to stay away because there's so much variance with the output of defenses. And there's some other guys that Adam just mentioned, other teams that I don't think are that much worse plays. It might be owned a lot less.
Yeah, I would say like 18 to 20.
And for me to not play it in tournaments or to take an underweight, it would have to be up around 40 or 50. I'm so confident.
Oh man.
Maybe it's my Bears hatred going on in this in this instance, but man, I feel like it's very likely that they're able to find the end zone. I think it's very unlikely that the Bears score, more than 15 points. So I think they're shoo-in. The ownership would have to be really, really high to dissuade me.
Yeah, I remember last week we thought a bunch of defense were shoe-ins as well, and it did not happen.
Different story on the road when the best matchups are on the road. Best matchup at home. Whew. Like if you could give me any matchup all season long, what's the best defense versus opposing offense matchup that you would take? For me, I think it's this one.
Yeah,
and it's Clausen.
Or Clausen.
Santa Clausen just handing out gifts to DFS players.
I agree with you. All I'm saying is that last week, like it seems like the tournament teams that were doing well, like not even had like Cleveland, but it seemed like they just had like the Oakland Raiders defense, which was like minimum salary last week. Oakland is, I think, 2,700 again against Cleveland.
Positive points was a GPP winner on defense.
Exactly. As long as you did not have the Ravens or New Orleans, you were feeling good about your team defense. All right, 2 more games to go. Denver at Detroit, and this one's definitely going to be an interesting one, Adam.
Yeah, I think this is really an interesting spot for Peyton Manning and the Denver pass game. We saw them kind of catch fire once they went to the hurry up last week. If they continue that, I think they'll have a lot of success against the Detroit secondary that is pretty inept. Even though Detroit got run on pretty badly by Adrian Peterson, I don't think that Denver will be able to run the ball nearly as effectively. So I think this is a nice spot to get on Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders in tournaments while everybody else is on Antonio Brown and Julio Jones. I think that even though I think Peyton Manning is relatively done still, I think that in this matchup, he could see enough volume and Detroit's secondary is bad enough where he could really pay off in a tournament. And the sneaky guy on the other side of the ball that I like is Eric Ebron with Brandon Pettigrew hobbled by a hamstring injury. Ebron has actually taken a huge step forward, seen a ton of targets, run a ton of routes, and you want to stay away from the Broncos corners like Chris Harris and Bradley Roby and Akeem Talib, and you prefer to attack them at the linebacker position with Eric Ebron. So I think it sets up nicely for him to be a sneaky GPP play as well.
Andrew, I was a little, I don't know, not perplexed considering Peyton's, considering his woes this season and the end of last season. But when you give Peyton Manning 10 days to prepare for his next game, I still think that Vegas total that they projected was a little lower than what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, well, they're on the road. They're projected for almost 24 points. It seems reasonable. The guy who is getting no love is poor Manny Sanders, who's quietly averaging 13 targets a week. He seems like, Peyton obviously has a lot of trust in him. He's looked fantastic. He's the guy who just people don't seem to want to own, but the upside's there, the matchup's there. He's a guy that I'd look to in tournaments. I think Demaryius as well. Even when Peyton made a few errant passes at the end of that last game, Demaryius was there to bail him out and made some fantastic grabs. I wouldn't be surprised if any of these guys go off, and I think I wouldn't really consider them in cash games so much, but tournaments, they're going to go under-owned, and you always have upside with Peyton and those guys catching the ball.
Yeah, the only thing about Peyton Manning is it seems like his DraftKings price this week that has not accounted for his recent struggles. So he's still at that elite level with those other guys. So, you're definitely paying up for him in a GPP tournament type atmosphere. This next game, though, is going to be another fun Monday night. I'll be in Boston hosting the live sweat show. And this game is going to determine probably a lot. So Kansas City at Green Bay, and a lot of different angles to talk about. So we'll start with you, Drew, as far as what you're wanting to do with this game.
I'm really excited for another Monday Night Sweatshirt with Aaron DeKing Rogers, right? So we'll have Rogers on Monday night. Possibly no Eddie Lacy. We have to follow that situation throughout the week. Obviously, if Lacy is out, that would open up James Stark's minimum price as a really nice value play. But if Lacy's hobbled or if Lacy's out, I think Rodgers, I think he'll be contending for that top quarterback spot. In Kansas City's defense, you've been able to throw on it so far early in the season. We saw, the comeback last week from Peyton Manning. We saw in week 1, DeAndre Hopkins have a huge game. So I think the Packers passing side of the game is going to be really interesting. Randall Cobb returned to that 30+% market share of targets last week that we used to see Jordy Nelson get. So I think he's healthy again and established as that number 1 wide receiver. I really like Green Bay's offense in this matchup.
Adam, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, Kansas City's outside corners have really struggled. I think that it's a fine spot for Randall Cobb. I think it's another James Jones touchdown spot, even though I hate him and I won't use him, but I do think it is a James Jones touchdown spot. Aaron Rodgers is just so expensive. I don't know. What do you guys think his ownership will be given how expensive he is this week? I mean, obviously everybody wants to use him, but will they be able to fit him into their lineup?
I'd guess 5-6%. Yeah, I don't think he's going to be highly owned.
Yeah, I was going to say under 10.
Yeah, I'd agree too. So in that spot, I think Aaron Rodgers is a good play for tournaments. I'm not opposed to using Jamal Charles at all in this spot. Game flow neutral back, never opposed to using Jamal Charles. I mean, I just want this Eddie Lacy news. I want it now. I want him to be ruled out so that I can start making some sick lineups with James Starks. That's really all I want. Should I ask the Pope for Eddie Lacy news?
Jamal Charles could be also a guy if they get behind, we have seen the past where Jamal Charles is like just absent for a whole half, but I don't think it's going to be that case in this week. Andrew, your thought about like using Charles as that top running back in that 5 running back tier on DraftKings this week?
I like Charles. He looked awfully crisp last week against a tough Denver run D. He fumbled a couple times, but that's not something I'm overly concerned about. I think he's a strong consideration because of the fact that he'll be in there even if they're behind catching passes. I think Travis Kelce's a guy you could consider. The biggest concern with him so far is the targets haven't really been there, but when they have targeted him, he's generally caught the ball and looked really good. You'd think that they'd make it a priority to get the ball more to him. It's Andy Reid, so I wouldn't make any assumptions. You always want to be planning on what people will do, not what you think they should do. And that's kind of certainly the case with Andy Reid. The other guy that his ownership just keeps going down and down, I'm sure it's going to be really low this week, is Devontae Adams. He's got that big game in him. I really like him for tournaments this week because I think he's just going to go completely overlooked after burning people 2 weeks in a row. So he's a guy to look at for a pretty reasonable price.
And for that Kansas City offense, I think a really good comparison is week 1, the Bears offense. The way the Bears ran that offense in week 1, primarily through Matt Forte and primarily through Martellus Bennett, they attacked kind of the middle of the field against Green Bay because Alshon was a little nicked up on the outside. And I think that's a good model for how Kansas City will probably approach this game. So I think Jamal Charles is a really similar type back to Matt Forte in terms of their skill sets. So I think Charles and Kelce could have really nice games in this one too.
Yeah, as far as the primetime slate, so I may have been a little upset at how my teams were doing and entered the primetime 2-game slate last week. And I went Richard Rodgers on DraftKings over Jimmy Graham. And it was like probably the one good move I did in week 2, but it paid off. And Richard Rodgers, again, you have that late pricing that sometimes doesn't take into account the primetime games of the previous week. And Richard Rodgers, 2,500. And so when you think about like saving at the tight end position, for me, if I'm not going Gronk, I'm probably looking to save. We talked about Jordan Reed in the Thursday night game, and I think Richard Rodgers on Monday night, it would be another fun play, especially if they go for 2. I just think he's a red zone option now. And so definitely looking at him in that situation. But guys, that's the end of the DraftKings Week 3 matchup breakdown. Always good to talk to you guys. I feel like after talking with the 3 of you, I feel a lot better about my preparedness for Week 3. Of course, you might have caused the terrible Week 2 that I had. It's okay. We'll move past that. All right. I've got to ask you again, if you're targeting one game, Andrew, this week, what is it?
Probably the New England game or the Chicago game. Those are the two ones where it just seems pretty clear that both the New England and the Seattle offense are going to put points on the board, and there's a lot of good options. So I think I'll be sending a lot of my cash game action around those two offenses.
Drew?
Yeah, I would agree with those. And then Indy, Tennessee is just shaping up a game that I'm going to have a lot of exposure to, whether it's, Dante Moncrief or whether it's Kendall Wright. Or I just that game, I seem to be gravitating towards some of those mid-priced wide receivers.
Yeah, I would agree with that game. Adam?
Yeah, I'm off the board too with Indianapolis and Tennessee. Just matchups seem to be setting up the way that I like. Bleedy Reed Wilson is active, which is amazing, and the corner situation for the Colts is so transparent that I think it makes for a great spot for us to attack.
All right, so I'm going to that game. I want to have exposure to that game, but just for the show's sake, I'm going to diversify, and I'm going to say that Kansas City and Green Bay game because I just think it'll be a really fun game to sweat. And in the past 2 weeks, that's not really been the case as far as the fun primetime games that we think we're going to be sweating, but I'm hoping that third week is a charm. So Kansas City at Green Bay is a game that I think I'm going to hopefully enjoy on Monday night. Again, Monday night, the Sweat Show live from Boston. Guys, appreciate you joining us. Make sure you're checking out all the other content on the DraftKings Playbook and the Daily Fantasy Edge podcast that Adam Levitan does. So for Adam, Andrew, Drew, and myself, we'll see you later, and good luck this week.